call the grind, bro.
Scott Pilgrim Takes Off is incredible. I don't drink, this is just Coke Zero. There it is. Scott Pilgrim vs. the World is one of my all-time favorite movies. Possibly the favorite movie. Comes from one of my favorite directors, Edgar Wright. The comic book is also incredible. Written by Brian Lee O'Malley, the 6-volume manga-styled comic tells the story of Scott Pilgrim, who has to fight the 7 evil exes of his new girlfriend, Ramona Flowers. It's a genius metaphor for relationships and dating in your 20s. It's a fantastic series. It's so funny. It's really, really good, and I like it a lot. It's also one of the most Canadian fucking things ever, and I love that. It's one of the best, like, representations of Toronto, Canada in any film ever. Like, it's probably the best Canadian movie ever made, and it's not even directed by a Canadian. It is so fun to see real locations that I have been to and am familiar with in a real movie, and where Toronto is like actually playing itself and not another city. Anyways, the point is I really like fucking Scott Pilgrim, so naturally I was very excited when they announced an animated series coming to Netflix. Could you call it an anime? I don't know. Is Scott Pilgrim a manga? It's Canadian. It looks like a manga. So, I don't know, you do the math. And of course, was very excited to see that we're bringing back all of the cast from the original movie too, which is great. The cast is phenomenal. A ton of great actors, most of which who became famous and went on to do like really big things after this movie. So it's super cool to see them all come back now that they're all like mega famous people. And to do an animated series in the style of the comic, like you had me at Scott Pilgrim. What I was not prepared for is that this show takes the Scott Pilgrim story and then goes in a completely other direction with it. I'm gonna spoil the first episode, and I might touch on minor spoilers throughout the rest of the series, but I won't get into like specific details. The short version of this video is the animated show Scott Pilgrim Takes Off is really fucking good, and you should watch it. Especially if you're a fan of the comic or the movie. You're gonna have a good time, I think. And you're in for something new and fresh that is different, but also really good. So check it out. So I've read the comic multiple times, I've seen the movie about a bazillion times, and this is a story that I'm very intimately familiar with. I've also played some of the video game, which also covers basically the same story. So this is a story I'm very familiar with. I quote this movie with my friends all of the time. I like it a lot. It's good. So going into this, I was kind of expecting to be fairly familiar with what was going to happen. The comic obviously is a lot longer than the movie, so there's a lot of stuff that doesn't end up making it in, although the movie itself does a very good job of both being extremely faithful to the comic and managing to condense a huge amount of story into just under 2 hours, while also pulling in as many like references and little jokes and lines of dialogue and stuff from the comic as possible. And of course, with Edgar Wright's masterful directing,
so yeah, 8 o'clock?
He's one of those types of directors that can pack that amount of stuff into one movie and have it be cohesive. Anyways, the point is, the show starts out basically the same as the movie and the comic. It follows the first volume pretty closely. Some of the dialogue is different. They even pull in a few moments that were cut from the movie but were in the original comic. But more or less, the first episode follows pretty much the same structure, until we get to the first fight with Ramona's first evil ex, Matthew Patel. And in this fight, Scott fucking dies. They kill off Scott Pilgrim in the pilot episode of the Scott Pilgrim animated series, which is great. You'd think I'd be mad, but I'm not, because now suddenly this story that I'm extremely familiar with, and this franchise that I've been a fan of for years at this point, now suddenly I don't know what's gonna fucking happen. It could go in any direction, and I don't know what to expect. This also gives us a chance to focus on a lot of the other characters, primarily Ramona. Ramona kind of becomes the main character of the show, and it becomes sort of a whodidit, trying to figure out what happened to Scott and who did it. This gives Ramona a lot more agency than she has in the movie. She is more of her own character in the comic because they just have more time to flesh her out. But I really like this angle because it still explores the same concepts and the same themes and the same characters, but in this totally new lens. We get to see all these characters interact in brand new ways, but in a way that still feels faithful to the source material. I'm sure a big part of this is due to the fact that Brian Lee O'Malley is one of the main writers on this show. He co-wrote, I think, almost every episode, and like it shows, the characters feel authentic to the characters you already know and love, but we get to see them in brand new contexts, and that's really fun and cool. I like it. It's like so creative and interesting. We get a completely different version of the story, but it's also good and compelling and cool and interesting. I've never seen anything like this. And part of this could be like just because I'm already a big fan of this series, and so doing something different and new is like really exciting to me because I don't know what to expect, versus a movie that I've seen a million times and can quote word for word. And getting a chance to spend with all these different other characters is like super fun because I like all these other characters. Also, the animation is so good in this show. It looks fucking incredible. It's over the top when it needs to be. It's not afraid to get like really weird and exaggerated with its like proportions and angles and posing and stuff. It's just a really cool looking show overall. The fight scenes are incredible and super creative and interesting. There's a fight scene that takes place in a video rental store, and then like a shelf of movies falls down on the characters fighting, and then they like wind up in different movie scenes, and so then they like the scene takes on like the aesthetic of different classic movie genres. It's super fun and creative like all the way through. If you're not convinced, check out the skateboarding scene with Lucas Lee set to the United States of whatever. Fucking rules. It's so fucking good. I can't even really think of a good comparison of this show and like why it feels so fresh and original, even though it's like a thing I'm familiar with. One of the only things that I think of that's kind of similar is there was a He-Man reboot that Kevin Smith did on Netflix, and like I've never seen the original He-Man, so I didn't really have like any prior attachment to it, but they did a similar thing where in the pilot episode they kill off He-Man, so then the rest of the season becomes about like the other characters, and I was like kind of really into that. Seeing the fallout and the loss of like a main character felt through the supporting characters who are now elevated to main character status with the absence of the title character. There's something that I find interesting about that premise. Of course, He-Man eventually came back in that show, and that was kind of when I sort of lost interest, but I don't know. I'm not a big He-Man guy. I don't really have like the full context to judge whether or not that's satisfying as a like long-term fan. I'm more of a She-Ra stan. That's the good shit right there. But for Scott Pilgrim, like hell yeah, give me a fucking completely different thing. I'm on board. And of course they do play with like why things are different this time. There is an explanation eventually. We get references and callbacks to like how things were supposed to play out and why they're playing out differently this time. But it's done in a way that I really like, and it both gives us just like completely new stuff, which I think is super cool. And it also like recontextualizes and kind of reinterprets the original story in really interesting ways. See, one thing that people don't always get about Scott Pilgrim is that Scott is kind of a bad guy. Like, he's not a great person. They go into this a lot more in the comic. The movie does a little bit gloss over this because they do have to like fit so much in, and and he has to fight 7 evil exes. So the story becomes kind of more about him. And we a little bit lose some of Ramona's perspective from the comic. Like in the movie, sometimes Ramona feels a little more like a plot device than like a full fleshed out character. Don't get me wrong, I still really like her, and I really love Mary Elizabeth Winston. I think she's excellent. But there are moments where she doesn't have as much agency as Scott does. But, you know, part of that is due to plot things as well. It's a whole thing. I reread the comic recently, building up to this, even though it almost doesn't even matter because the show just goes in a completely different direction. But one of the things I really like about the comic that I think is super smart and also kind of subtle is that while Scott is going through Ramona's evil exes in chronological order, Ramona's actually dealing with Scott's evil exes in reverse chronological order. She has a fight with Knives in the second volume. In the third volume, she has a fight with Envy. In the fourth volume, she ends up spending a lot of time with Lisa, who we only hear about in the movie.
That time with Lisa?
That was a misunderstanding.
But she's like a full character in the comic. And her and Scott have an interesting relationship where they didn't actually date, but they were like really close friends in high school. And there was always this like sort of weird romantic tension between the two of them. And then that kind of gets paralleled further in the present day when Scott reconnects with Lisa. And then the fifth volume has a lot of stuff with Kim. Kim and Ramona actually become really good friends. And Kim is really interesting because she's kind of the only ex in either of these characters' lives who like didn't go evil at any point. And I think it's just because she's like cool. Like she's just a good person, unlike everyone else in this series. So there's a ton of like really interesting stuff, and we start to see that Scott has also not been the best boyfriend in many of his past relationships, including and especially the one with Knives, a 17-year-old
Chinese schoolgirl. You're ridiculous.
It's a Catholic school, too.
So, you know, that's not great. And all of that is like really cool and interesting, and they explore that a lot more in the comic. And they're able to explore some of those ideas here in the show as well. Because we're exploring things from Ramona's perspective, we're seeing that maybe Scott wasn't always a great guy, and maybe he's actually has a lot of really toxic traits, actually. At the same time, we're able to explore Ramona and her relationship with her evil exes in like a totally new way, in a way that's like really interesting and fleshes them all out and gives them cool things to do, which is smart and cool also, because we have Chris Evans, and we should use Chris Evans in probably my favorite role of his.
Big fan.
Why wouldn't you be?
I love Lucas Lee. He's so fun. I want to have his adopted babies. The other thing that I think is super cool and interesting about this show is that it's kind of doing the exact reverse thing of every other adaptation that's out there right now. Instead of adapting something from a book or comic and bringing it into live action, or adapting an old animated thing and bringing that into live action, it's taking a live action movie and adapting it into an animated thing, which is objectively the superior medium. Fight me. And at the same time, instead of just rehashing the same story, but again, we're doing a completely brand new story. It's so good. It's good on every level. I love it. The soundtrack is also really great, both in brand new songs that we get, which are all really good, as well as use of pre-existing songs. Like I mentioned, United States of Whatever, just the perfect vibe for Scott Pilgrim. It nails it. 10 out of 10 good songs. Nick Pegg and Simon Frost get a cameo. It's fun. I like it. It's really good. I don't have more to say, really. I just wanted to gush about this show that I think rules, and you should check out. I'm extremely curious. Let me know in the comments if there are any people out there who have not read the comic or seen the movie, but watched the show just blind, just for the first time, and like what your thoughts are. Like, did it work for you at all? Were you into it? Were you like, what the fuck is this? Because they are intentionally playing with like your expectations of what's going to happen. So I'm very curious to see if there's anyone out there that like had not seen the original movie and watched this show for some reason. If that's you, what did you think? Like, what, were you into it? Were you not into it? I'm extremely curious. Anyways, that's it for this video. Thank you for watching. Go watch Scott Pilgrim. Go watch Scott Pilgrim Takes Off. It's really good. Can we get more things like this, please? That would be nice. Thank you. If you're new here, subscribe, hit the bell, all those things. I do videos about stuff that I find interesting. We're going through the original Teen Titans animated series right now, so check those out if you want. Check out, I did a video about Puffy Amiyumi, the band that did the theme song for the Teen Titans theme. It's a Japanese pop band. They got their own cartoon. Pretty weird. It's a fun video. You'll like it, probably. That's it. Play the song. Play me out. Bye-bye.